Never thought this day would come. The Apple sheep is trying out an iPhone and he's not recommending it. Sorry I couldn't come up with some creative defense rant about why everyone on YouTube is wrong and this is the greatest thing of all time, but 2020 is a weird year for a multitude of reasons. This is just one of them, and there's definitely a lot to talk about here, and I also want to briefly touch on why so many people rush to defend this thing, but overall I do not think you should get the iPhone 12 Pro, and that is weird because in years prior, pretty much every iPhone that's ever come out, I could usually imagine one market or at least one demographic where it would make sense for that type of person to buy an iPhone. Even in weird years like 2017, it was like, okay, if you want the latest iPhone but you want it to be small and you prefer the home button, iPhone 8 is good for you. And if you want something that's bigger with longer battery and a better camera, then the 8 Plus is great. But if you want something in between that's futuristic but expensive, but obviously has a much better display and a better biometric, then the iPhone 10 is good for that demographic. It's like the best of the best, and some people wanted the iPhone SE, and I could see why that market fits it well, and I could see why some people would buy an iPhone 5C. There's markets for everything, but I truly, genuinely can't find a good place to put the 12 Pro, and I'll tell you why today. Let's begin. I don't completely hate this phone. As you guys know, it's mainly just an argument of why the iPhone 12 is significantly better, but I thought today it would make sense to start off with the updated design, because I think that's the most noticeable change this year. This squared off look, which in my opinion, looks amazing. I love how Apple found a way to make something new and fresh and yet familiar at the same time. Of course, a lot of us who have been rocking iPhones since the 4 and 5 days notice that recognizable squared off design, and it's iconic, and at the same time, they're able to make it fresh and new with the stainless steel very, very sharply hitting the glass. And I don't know what it was, you know, there wasn't necessarily a bunch of new features this year with the 12 Pro coming from my 11 Pro Max, and yet every time I turned this display on and held it, it felt different, it felt new, and the bezels being somewhat thinner is part of it, but I think the main reason the squared off design looks more clean and looks more futuristic is simply because the glass not being curved anymore is not picking up as much light as older iPhones used to. So ever since the iPhone 6, we've had that curved 2.5D glass on the top, and that picks up a lot of your surrounding environment. And just straight up looking at the front of the phone, for one, that means that the steel or the aluminum on the edge is more noticeable, and the glass stands out more because of how it picks up more light being reflected back at you. And the fact that we're now going to flat, for one, pays homage to kind of the 2018 iPad Pro design, my favorite Apple product. So the fact that the iPhone can match up with the iPad a lot better now is nice, although I guess that does come at the compromise of it no longer matching the Apple Watch, which I feel like not that many people have brought up. In years prior, iPhones and Apple Watches could go hand in hand pretty well, but now they kind of have a different design language, and maybe we'll see that changed in the Apple Watch next year. But the glass being more straight and simple, I think gives it that more modern look, and I really, really do genuinely think the squared off design looks better than the older iPhone rounded off design that we've had for so long. But I will also admit, having used the 12 Pro for a few weeks now, and then going back to my 11 Pro Max and picking it up, the rounded edges and this rounded, more dated looking design actually feels way more comfortable in the hand. And at first, I thought I might get used to the squared off design and eventually come around on it and decide that it feels the same. But sadly, every time I pick up my 11 Pro Max, it just ever so softly fits in my hand and doesn't cut into it as much as the 12 Pro. Not to say that it's like super duper uncomfortable or like a deal breaker. You can still use the phone fine. I'm just saying if I had to pick up two iPhones and you specifically asked me which one fits more comfortably in my hand, I would definitely have to choose the rounded off design. So I'm kind of split on it if you couldn't tell. I like the way the squared off edge looks, but I also prefer the way this feels. So part of me wonders if someday Apple's thinking about going back to the rounded design. I really wouldn't mind it that much because it feels very comfortable. But in the meantime, if Apple's needing to add some things to the design to make it look fresh and new, this is a great way to do it. And maybe if you want my advice, Apple, you should consider making the chassis rounded on the back but flat on the front. That way we get the minimal clean look on the front of the device, but the more comfortable soft feel of the rounded edge. This might be a horrible idea, I don't know, but I appreciate the updated design, but of course that is not an exclusive feature to the 12 Pro. In fact, fact, if anything, the 12 Pro, in my opinion, looks objectively worse than the 12 simply because this stainless steel, while it is heavier and some feel like that gives it the illusion of being more durable, it always looks terrible. It's picking up fingerprints, it's picking up lots of oils and creases, and I haven't had this issue myself, but I've seen other people talk about how this flat edge steel picks up little micro scratches a lot easier than aluminum, and because of that, your 12 Pro, which I got in Pacific Blue, will never look the way it does on the website. I know we love checking out the web page renders, and you look at the Apple Store app and you're comparing prices and you're like, wow, that 12 Pro looks so much more premium and luxurious. Yeah, sorry, it never looks like that. After just a couple of minutes of using the phone, you will notice the fingerprints and smudges all over it. It doesn't look pretty, and I am constantly trying to clean this thing off so that it looks good, and just to get the B-roll shots for this video, I'm having to constantly clean off the steel, and even after just 100 seconds of using the phone again, it looks terrible. So most people are probably going to use a case anyway, and because of that, don't feel like you need to buy this phone simply because the steel looks nice, because trust me, in real life usage, it really does not look good. The other thing I would argue does not look good is this giant millimeter wave antenna or window to the antenna. I'm sorry, some people get picky about that, but it adds a lot of complexity to the side of the phone, which is a bit of a shame in my opinion. It would be nice if just at least one side could have a clean look. The cleanest looking side is probably the top because there's only one antenna band there, but the fact that so many people buying the iPhone 12 are almost guaranteed to never utilize millimeter wave makes this whole sensor cutout on the side thing somewhat distracting and annoying to me, because I know for a fact I'm never going to use millimeter wave, and I know lots of you are probably never going to use millimeter wave. No matter how many antennas they put up, there's still going to be a bunch of places where the signal is blocked either by a building or a piece of paper or a fly, and yeah, like I said before, unless you're climbing on top of the 5G tower, you're really not going to get those ideal conditions Apple talked about. And feel free to go back and watch my video about 5G marketing and how terrible it is, and how I really think Apple went way too far with the 5G crap this year, but maybe they had to in order to get their carriers off their back, because Apple was the one company this year that decided to not incorporate the term 5G into the naming. I'll thank them for that. You know, they were nonstop during the event talking about 5G and how it's going to solve all of the world's problems, but at least we don't have to call it the 12 Pro 5G, because that would have annoyed the crap out of me. So what are the biggest advantages with picking a 12 Pro over the 12? Functionally, I would have to say it mainly comes down to the camera. On the 12 Pro, we're rocking the same old telephoto lens. No real updates there. It's the same telephoto lens we've had on the past few years of iPhones. And the LiDAR sensor, which I must say is one of the most disappointing additions this year, because there were leaks, I think even back in 2019, that Apple was planning on adding a time-of-flight sensor, you know, a 3D mapping sensor to the iPhone next year. And whenever we read about that, I always thought that was going to be some type of, oh, this is going to be really great for portrait mode video, or this is going to have some kind of features, because Apple rarely just adds a sensor for the sake of adding a sensor. They want to add features, right? And in my opinion, the features that LiDAR allows for is so gimmicky and so rarely utilized that it's rarely something I could ever see people appreciating on the daily. So most of the updates to the camera this year came to low light performance, and LiDAR slightly helps with you doing autofocus at nighttime, which starts to get a little bit silly here because, all right, night mode is great and everything. Some of the pictures I can get with night mode are, of course, amazing. They were amazing on the iPhone 11, but something I was excited for with the 12 Pro this year is that they're bringing night mode to all the camera sensors. So now you can do it on the ultra wide, you can do it on the front-facing camera, but the thing is, when you're utilizing LiDAR, you know, for like low light photography and stuff, typically you have a subject that's pretty close to the camera when you're doing portrait mode photography, and a lot of the time we forget that our phones have flash on them. The iPhone 12, which is much cheaper, also has flash, and when your subject is in the range that the iPhone needs you to be in order to take a portrait mode photo, the flash is actually still pretty useful. And I've seen a lot of examples in my daily life where using the flash, sure, it washes out the colors a little bit, but you can edit it to be a tad more saturated to get some of that color back. But overall, whenever I take a low light night mode shot utilizing LiDAR and the telephoto lens and all that, it looks fairly blurry and it doesn't capture a lot of detail. And honestly, I experienced better performance just by using the flash instead. So I think with all this hype about low light computational photography, a lot of the time we throw out logic of how our phones used to deal with low light. I'm sorry it blinds people on occasion, but still, big price difference between the 12 and 12 Pro is around $120 once you factor in the updated 128 gig model for the iPhone 12. And in my opinion, these camera differences are not worth an additional $120. So yeah, you can shoot Dolby Vision HDR at 60 FPS instead of 30, but the Dolby Vision thing is a huge mess as well, because you can really only appreciate that video when you're watching it on your iPhone. If you want to put it on your iPad or your Mac, suddenly the HDR stuff doesn't work. And if anything, you might be better off just turning off HDR video, because then you can utilize it on more devices. You can actually record something and then edit it on a Mac and upload it. So I do vlogging. I did do a vlog on my 12 Pro, and when I tried to vlog with Dolby Vision turned on, Final Cut Pro and my Mac don't like it. They don't want to edit that, and even when you do get the footage to show up, it looks terrible, obviously. So until Apple can actually bring more Dolby Vision HDR support to more of their devices, it's kind of useless. It looks great on the device, but I don't just record videos on my phone so that I can just watch them on my device, and I would not call HDR Dolby Vision a must-have feature. It's not like, dude, you gotta try it, it's a game changer. Yeah, every time I pull up an HDR video on the 12 Pro, yeah, the brightness boosts up like crazy. It's very noticeable. You can tell as soon as an HDR video is playing because it boosts up the brightness to the maximum, and if anything, it's a little distracting when they do that because your display brightness will be at like 50 or 40%, but then you pull out the HDR video and it's like, brightness! Look at all these colors! It's a little obnoxious, in my opinion. So, if you were thinking Dolby Vision was gonna be this great flagship feature, sorry, I don't think so. It's very gimmicky right now, and anyone who really knows or cares about HDR is gonna want to take the footage off of their device and actually edit it on something, which not a lot of devices are supporting it in the first place. And I can't necessarily say that's going to change and get way better in time because there's so many different HDR formats, but when it comes to video, it's still great, it's still amazing, and I'm still very impressed with the camera. It's just not significantly better than the 11 series, and definitely not significantly better on the 12 Pro compared to the regular 12. Also, the ultra-wide camera was a bit more disappointing to me this year. I was really hoping that we could actually get some more crisp images, because the ultra-wide was always known on the 11 series for being a little bit too soft and a little bit too smooth and not very sharp compared to the other sensors, and it feels like this lens didn't really get many updates. It still feels pretty soft, and when you do night mode on the ultra-wide camera, it's a joke. A lot of the pictures I took with night mode on the ultra-wide, because its aperture isn't as good as the main lens, it's like, okay, yeah, technically better than before, but still fairly blurry, and in my opinion, there's a lot of night mode shots that I would use with the regular lens, but as soon as I tried to take a photo with the ultra-wide, it was downright unusable and just so plain blurry that I wouldn't even want to try. So I'll reserve judgment for the 12 Pro Max camera, which apparently has a whole fleet of new sensors, including a new ultra-wide sensor, so that might be a very different story than this, but iPhone 12 and 12 Pro are not the iPhones they went all out on the cameras with. I think it was mainly about making the 12 and 12 mini such an amazing deal, which is why you should buy those. And the other thing that's kind of hard to appreciate about the regular old telephoto lens on the 12 Pro is a lot of the time, even in fairly well-lit situations, the camera will default back to the regular lens because the computer realizes the telephoto lens, because it hasn't been updated and has a more dated aperture, if you try to take a shot with the telephoto, it's not going to look very good. The lighting isn't very crisp, and the shot would overall look worse if you stayed with the telephoto lens. So in those situations, the computer will actually jump back to the standard lens. And I've noticed this in a lot of environments. Pretty much unless you're outside or in a super well-lit room, your camera, even though it has that little 2x button, it's not utilizing the telephoto lens. And in my experience, it's been like 50% of the time, when you press that 2x button, it's literally just a digital zoom, which I feel kind of weird about, and considering that's probably the most noticeable change by going with the 12 Pro over the 12, I can't put a $120 price tag on that. Same with the whole RAM argument, because yes, I know, the 12 Pro has 6 gigs of RAM, iPhone 12 has 4 gigs of RAM, but here's the thing. It's in Apple's best interest to get you to spend as much money as possible on iPhones, and if there was something the 12 Pro did objectively better in with multitasking performance, I think they would have brought that up. And the fact that they didn't bring that up is probably because it doesn't make a huge difference. I jumped from an iPad Pro with 4 gigs of RAM to an iPad Pro with 6 gigs of RAM, and you know what? It behaved identically the same. Unless you're doing those side-by-side comparisons where you launch like 30 apps at once and close them all and open them up again. Other than those speed tests, which no one actually does, I don't think you'll notice a difference. Most of the apps on iOS are still going to be optimized for 4 gigs of RAM devices, not 6, and I don't see Apple closing off support on just the 12s, but not the 12 Pro, so I don't think it's a fair argument to say that this will age way better because it has an extra 2 gigs of RAM, especially because there's no split screen multitasking on these phones anyway. You're really only using one app at a time, maybe picture-in-picture. In those situations, the extra 2 gigs of RAM, it really does not make a colossal difference. Going from my 11 Pro Max, which had 4 gigs of RAM, to the 12 Pro with 6, I could not see any difference in how often apps were left open or closed in the background. iOS still has very great RAM management compared to Android, and I think 4 gigs is fine for an iPhone. And the other thing a lot of people seem to miss is that while Apple lists the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro as having the same battery life, in a lot of battery tests I've seen, the 12 Pro actually died a little bit sooner, despite them both having the same size battery. So many of the parts actually between the 12 and 12 Pro are interchangeable. But yeah, maybe it's from the extra RAM, or maybe it's from the slightly brighter display, or maybe the LiDAR and telephoto lens doing something extra, I don't know. But overall, the 12 Pro in battery tests actually dies sooner than the 12. So if you want to talk about longevity and which iPhone's going to age better, I think you can make the argument the iPhone 12 might age better because the power draw on it isn't as much as the 12 Pro is. So with battery degradation, you'll probably have better luck with the 12 than the 12 Pro. But overall, I must say, despite the 12 Pro getting slightly worse battery than the 12, it's been great for me. Of course, battery life is going to depend on what you're doing. So if you're on 5G carriers a lot, you may notice your battery life draining a lot faster, but I don't go anywhere. I work from home, so I'm here most of the time, and in my experience, I could get 7 to 8 hours of screen on time with the 12 Pro, which is plenty to get me through the day. Typically, I was ending the day with a 40 or 30% battery left, and I was playing games, watching YouTube, listening to music, browsing the web, texting people. Kind of a mild use, so I'm sure if you were doing some kind of high-intensive gaming or recording videos all the time, yeah, you're not going to see the same screen on time that I am. But yeah, the battery life is a bit worse than the 11 Pro, which kind of sucks considering it's a bigger phone with a bigger display and yet a worse battery than last year. Kind of weird, but still, in my opinion, enough to last you through the day. You're still going to charge it at night just like you would with most other phones, but also noticeably worse battery life than my 11 Pro Max, but that's to be expected because this currently has the best battery life of any iPhone out there, and also this is the largest battery capacity in terms of milliamp hours of any iPhone in existence, because the 12 Pro Max battery is actually smaller than this year's, and this doesn't have 5G, so I'm guessing that battery life wise the 11 Pro Max is the undefeated champ, but still plenty good on the 12 Pro. This is like excess. I could easily last 2 days with this phone, 1 day, maybe a day and a half with the 12 Pro, but since I'm home all the time, battery life is not a huge concern. And overall, while it was a fine phone to use, and I'm sure a lot of you are probably watching this on the 12 Pro, or for whatever reason, you like stainless steel for some reason, or you just really need that telephoto lens, the main reasons I don't see the 12 Pro as worth it is, of course, because the 12 is so much better deal, and the differences between these two phones, in my opinion, do not warrant an additional $120. Telephoto lens is rarely utilized in photography. The LiDAR sensor is not that impressive with AR demos. It's not like the iPhone 12 can't do augmented reality stuff. It can. It's just slightly slower, and I don't think most of us are doing the AR stuff anyway. Yeah, in the Measure app, there's always some kind of Easter egg with LiDAR. Hey, it'll tell you how tall this person is, but the measurements are still really inaccurate. I've measured like 4 or 5 people with the LiDAR sensor, and it's not correct. It's usually several inches off, and now I'm hearing that LiDAR can help tell you how far away you are from another person. Based on my usage of the Measure app, I'm pretty confident it's not that accurate in the first place, and if you're trying to keep 6 feet away from someone, I think you can eyeball it. I don't think you need to pull out the LiDAR sensor. Hold on! Are we the appropriate distance? This is telling us we're 5'11" away. We need to be 6 feet away. Don't be that guy. Don't be the 12 Pro LiDAR guy. And the one thing that I noticed was different about the 12 Pro series this year, and this form factor, which in my opinion is the main reason you should stay away from it, is despite it being $1,000, which in today's world I still think is a lot for a phone, it's not really the best at anything, which is kind of hard to recommend because this is not the best battery life we've seen in any iPhone. It's worse than the regular 12 and worse than the 11 Pro it's replacing, and the camera is also no longer the best iPhone camera. I think a lot of people glossed over this. Think about it. For the past few years, if you were willing to spend $1,000 on an iPhone, that meant you got the best possible camera. iPhone 10, that had its dual optical image stabilization, and the telephoto lens was better in low light and that kind of thing. That was the best camera in an iPhone. iPhone 10s or 10s Max, didn't matter which size you got. If you were spending $1,000, you were getting the best possible camera. Same with the front-facing lens being updated to support 1080 at 60 and all that. And then with the iPhone 11 Pro and 11 Pro Max, again, didn't matter what size you were getting, you got the best camera. You got telephoto, ultra-wide, night mode, because if you're willing to spend $1,000 on a phone, you should get the best of the best camera performance, and now you don't with the 12 Pro. This is still second best because the 12 Pro Max is going to have a whole suite of new features added to the camera system that for whatever reason they couldn't bring into this model. And even as an Apple sheep, I'm going to put my foot down here and say that's unacceptable. I think when you're dropping $1,000 and they're branding it Pro, it should be getting the same camera systems as the larger option. And because they're charging the same amount as the past few years at $1,000, but the camera is no longer the best, what does this excel at? I mean, if your logic with the 12 Pro is, well, it's only $120 more, that's not really much. If you're spending $1,000 on a phone, might as well get the better one. I think you people are just impatient, because if your logic is it's only $120 more, well, then the 12 Pro Max is only $100 more, and that has largest display in an iPhone, way better battery life, better telephoto lens, better ultra-wide sensor, better image stabilization. That has a whole suite of better stuff for only $100 more. So I don't see how people are justifying, well, it's only $120 more. That whole game of upgrades is endless, and the fact that $1,000 no longer grants you the best camera in an iPhone anymore, I find somewhat disappointing, and I find this a bit of a letdown. You know, it'd be a different situation if the cameras were totally separate from the 12, kind of like how the 12 Pro Max is. If we got the 12 Pro Max cameras on the 12 Pro, maybe I would feel a bit different, and I would certainly feel a lot different, of course, if we actually got ProMotion on this display versus no ProMotion on the 12. Surely I could see that as being a maybe $120 upgrade, and something for the pros that techies would notice that the average consumer wouldn't, so putting it on a Pro phone versus 60 hertz on a non-Pro phone would have totally made sense, and honestly, I think that was the original goal. I think that's what Apple wanted when they started developing these phones, but because supply chains could not produce them at a high enough rate for the iPhone's demand, they couldn't make it work, and that's probably why they decided to default to the 12 Pro with 128 gigs, because they're like, oh crap, the Pro barely has anything over the regular 12, so they needed to give it something, throw in some extra RAM, but I guess we're not going to talk about that extra RAM. And this year was all about 5G, of course, which is just marketing gold for all of these big companies and a complete scam to the average consumer, because they get to walk up on stage and say, see, you can get up to 4 gigabits of speed, and then in reality it's barely better and it hurts your battery. And I've ran into several situations, and I've seen several people complain in different parts of the United States, of course it varies, but multiple YouTubers have said on their channel that when they turned off 5G, they got more consistent speeds. Sometimes they get better speeds, and I could say the same. When I turned off 5G, my speed test actually ended up being faster. I'm not saying it's always going to be faster, because carrier speeds vary heavy depending on where you are, so I don't want to hear, well, where I live, I turned off 5G and it was much fast. Okay, that's great. Just because you're not witnessing the problem doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And the fact is, there's a whole bunch of people that are not living in these major cities that are being told 5G is going to make all this phone stuff faster, when in reality it will either be marginally better or way worse and hurt your battery life faster, and the speeds will be more inconsistent. So don't buy this phone for 5G, that's for sure. And the 12 Pro doesn't even have the best camera Apple has to offer. It doesn't have the best battery life, and yet it's $1,000. So I feel like if you're coming this far, just go for the Pro Max at this point. And if that's too big for you, then, oh geez, I don't know, save yourself some money and buy an 11 Pro refurbished somewhere. I feel like that's going to get you longer battery, same great display you have here, and okay, you miss out on some gimmicky LiDAR demo, you know, big whoop. At least you'll have that telephoto lens and stainless steel you guys care so much about. So yeah, straight up, don't buy the 12 Pro. Pretty much anything else in the iPhone 12 lineup I would view as worth it, and don't eat me alive. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you in the next one.